You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Over the July 4th holiday weekend, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Shanghai summit was an opportunity for the leaders to get a global vision without the influence of the United States, but it also gave Putin a chance to demonstrate he's still in control of his nation in the aftermath of the Wagner uprising. From the viewpoint of journalists assigned to cover the conflict, it can be challenging to figure out what's really happening in Putin's Russia and on the ground in his war in Ukraine. Alongside soldiers, guns, tanks, and planes, both the invader and the invaded have deployed the tools of 21st century war. From photo manipulation to state propaganda and deflection, intelligence gathering in a modern world of deception creates a murky stew, leaving a reporter or a reader, well, where exactly? Jen Kirby joins me now. She's a senior foreign and national security reporter at Vox, where she covers global stability. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is very much a shooting war, but also a misinformation war. Has it been hard to cover?
It has been. I think that the war in Ukraine, in some ways, while the battlefield can sometimes look like something from the past, the battle that is playing out in the information space is very much of the future, both in how Russia and Ukraine are using information, but also about how journalists and reporters need to constantly evaluate and question even the things that we might have once thought of proof, like videos or audio, can now, with new technologies, be its own source of questioning.
I have become kind of an addict of all the video that proposes to tell what's going on in Ukraine. And sometimes in the same afternoon, you can see diametrically opposed versions of reality presented by people who really want you to believe them. How do you do the cross-hatching? How do you separate fact from fiction? Are you forced sometimes to wait a while, wait longer than you might have wanted?
I think patience is kind of the key for this because news will break so rapidly and you do have to sort of balance between, well, this is important and we need to cover it, but actually, how do we even know what is going on? And I think a perfect example of this is the Wagner rebellion. You have Prigozhin, who is the leader of this mercenary group, who's known for his own disinformation operations. You have the Russian state, which isn't really trustworthy. And you're trying to kind of piece together this narrative and what's happening, which is colossal and important. And at the same time, you're just basically like, nobody in this scenario is trustworthy. And in addition to that, people who are experts in Russia, who have followed Russia for years, are scratching their head and saying, what is going on? And so it's a balance of putting what we know, but also adding a qualifier of, we really don't know a lot. And we're just going to have to wait and see as the narrative shifts. What is happening now may look very different in an hour, in a day, in a few weeks.
Have you and all the reporters working this story over the last 16 months had to develop kind of a special Ukraine toolkit that's different from covering other things? People, techniques, tropes that over time have proven themselves either unreliable, reliable. Has it been kind of a group grope forward to get us to today?
Yes and no. I think it's always worth, when covering anything, to have a degree of skepticism and saying, okay, well, this is the information and facts that seem right now. Who might have a different interpretation of this? And if their interpretation is so out of line or so different from other people are saying, why is that? And kind of trying to move into the center to some degree and find some consensus. But I think that's true for a lot of events that we see, because information and disinformation is so much a part of our space right now that it is always worth taking those questions. At the same time, what makes, I think, Ukraine unique is the amount of tension that is on it and the amount of sort of social media and just content that is coming out of the battlefields, the governments, all of the players involved. I mean, we've definitely seen conflicts and rebellions play out on social media, but this seems to be at a level that is so different. Plus, you have open source intelligence analysts and just sort of this whole mix of players. So it's almost like there's just so much information to sort through right now because there's so much attention on it that in itself can make it difficult to just piece through, wade through, figure it out.
But there we go. I mean, you're talking about the advisability of really being sure before you go to the equivalent, the 21st century equivalent of press or go to air. Yet at the same time, we work in a business that values being first, being fast, beating competitors. Do those things sometimes work at cross purposes? Or are there some stories where when you finally feel sure about what you're saying, you almost are risking the moment being passed, where it feels late? It feels like, well, why is she telling me this? This is a week old.
Yeah. I think that is a really, really big struggle and something that I do struggle with a lot. I think about this with respect to the counteroffensive. I wrote a piece maybe a few weeks ago, sort of when it seemed as if things were really starting to pick up. And the entire time I said it over and over again, this is going to be a battle of weeks, maybe months, maybe even years. We don't know how this is going to play out. We need patience. Every village that falls, every setback is not going to be determinative of the outcome. And even now, just a few weeks into the counteroffensive, there's sort of this consensus growing that everything is slow moving and trying to interpret every battlefield move. But that's sort of the challenge of media, right? Like patience and the unknown don't really have the same compelling narrative as like Ukraine is winning or Ukraine is losing even to some degree. And so trying to find a way to convince people that it's okay to sort of sit in the space where we don't know. But at the same time, were we to wake up tomorrow and, that land bridge to Crimea would be complete and Ukraine has victory, people will be saying, how could you have missed this? How could you have not known that this was sort of forthcoming? And this is the fog of war, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily fit into our media space right now.
It seems like the fog is particularly challenging because of how the two combatants are choosing to handle themselves. Russia boldly asserts things that are simply not true and has worked hard to keep its own people in the dark about the state of fighting in Ukraine. Ukraine is simply, in a lot of cases, clammed up, gone dark, explained that it can't tell you things you want to know because such information is literally a war asset. The bottom lines thus are different, but do you have to watch yourself that you don't treat them as the same? Two sides lying to me. Are there different levels of accountability that are created by the different reasons for handling information the way the two combatants have?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because it's also something that I do struggle with because this is not a sort of both sides situation. You're thinking about this to some degree with the intensification of allegations around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, where Ukraine is saying, oh, Russia is planting potential explosives to create an attack. And Russia's saying, no, that's Ukraine. And these aren't just merely accusations lobbing back and forth, right? I mean, you have to look at what is the incentive for both sides to say it. And even as we are obviously in this situation because of Russia's aggression, Ukraine has an incentive to make Russia seem as if they are going to do this. And we know that they've done this in the past, right? With the dam incident just a few weeks ago. At the same time, Russia wants to create an information war space where Ukraine looks like the irresponsible party. And so trying to kind of, okay, we don't want to both sides that these are not the same. This wouldn't be happening if Russia was not occupying the power plant, but also trying to say, like, we actually don't know what the full scale of the situation is, and knowing, okay, what to make of these accusations. I don't necessarily even have a good answer for it, but trying to kind of peel them together and peel them apart is a real challenge.
So, given what you just said, what do you advise news consumers, people who are watching TV, reading Vox and other places, going online to get the latest? What should they bring to the act of harvesting the latest that, given what you've been through over the last year, you would say is pretty good MO for moving forward?
I think skepticism is honestly a good thing. And I sort of feel like I'm betraying the media because I'm saying don't necessarily trust what you see. But I think that there are a lot of reporters who are covering Ukraine. Most reporters who are covering Ukraine are doing a really fantastic job of really trying to present the uncertainty and the unknown. But I think as a news consumer, but also a consumer of social media and other kinds of content, nobody really knows what's going on except for the person, maybe even on the battlefield. Even then, it's hard to know. So, anybody who says they know anything for sure, Ukraine is winning, Russia is winning, or Ukraine is losing, Russia is losing, I would avoid sort of grandiose statements like that. And you should look for reporters and for people who present information that show the doubts and the uncertainty and the different possibilities and the different outcomes. Like one event can happen, but there can be multiple results from that. And those results may come, again, hours, days, weeks, and months. Embracing the uncertainty and knowing that as much as we all want information, it might not be available to us. And so looking for sources that are open and honest about what we don't know.
Let's turn, Jen, to Wagner, Prigozhin, Rostov, the road to Moscow, and the frantic 96 hours that unfolded when it looked like the Wagner elements were actually marching into Russia. Must have been a very confusing time, but also exciting and compelling, which makes it feel all the more imperative to sort of figure it out and get it right on the fly.
It was. And I think that is something where folks that I've talked to, officials, experts, everyone was just perplexed and amazed at this incredible course of events. As I said before, the different parties involved none of them are trustworthy. Prigozhin, the Russian media, the Russian state, Lukashenko in Belarus. So trying to figure out what actually is happening. And also thinking of, again, question of manipulation of information or facts, knowing that Prigozhin, say, put out an audio message, but not sort of seeing him in the early days. Well, what does that mean? Can we know for sure if he's alive?
Especially since he's a guy who has never been camera shy during this whole thing.
Exactly. And so I think in the week and a half after this has happened, it's still a matter of there are just so many questions that we still don't know. And they will start coming together. They will start coming out through intelligence leaks and other reporting. But I don't know if we will ever have the full picture of actually what went fully down. But I think at least in that moment, as I was covering it, my goal was to say, this is as much as what we know is happening right now. And it is raising lots and lots of questions about Russia's stability, Putin's control of power, the aftermath and consequences of the Ukraine war. And we probably cannot answer any of these questions and maybe won't for a really long time. And also making it clear that the story is developing, changing. The thing that is happening an hour from now might be very different in the next 10 or so. And just, again, trying to keep pace, but also taking a step back and saying, we don't know where we're going.
Do we even know where Yevgeny Prigozhin is?
Well, he is reportedly in Belarus, and that is according to Lukashenko, who is the Belarusian leader who allegedly brokered this deal to sort of give Prigozhin a way out, which is itself a fascinating and kind of incredible development. So we will see what happens, I suppose, if he really is there, and if he is there, for how long he will remain.
So we have his word for it. We have Lukashenko's word for it. And Putin, I guess we'll see where he lands. Has what he's said publicly and what the Russian state has said publicly since the Wagner troops stood down changed in tone or changed in specifics?
What was interesting to me is sort of how Putin seemed to take a back seat to some degree. And sort of as this unfolded, he gave a speech basically calling this mutiny treasonous as Wagner troops were marching on Moscow. And then all of a sudden in this flurry, Lukashenko made this deal, Prigozhin turned around. And the next day, Putin also gave kind of an address, which was, I don't know, it didn't really say much. It didn't sort of come across as anything beyond sort of the basics of what we knew. But in sort of the week that followed, he was out in public much, much more than he has been in recent years. He's not necessarily known as someone who likes to hobnob with the people, but he sort of seemed to be making his presence known in a way to sort of shore up his standing or power. And I think, again, there's still so many questions about what it will actually mean. There are certainly reports that there are military shakeups and that people who may have been associated with the rebellion or may have known are sort of coming in. But I think from my reporting so far, the one sort of main takeaway that I've heard is Putin really does value loyalty. And the problem with loyalty sometimes is it means you put people in power who are not necessarily the most competent. And I think that's the tension that we are ultimately seeing playing out with this rebellion and sort of the wider war, is that Putin is putting into place people he feels he can trust, but those people may not be able to tell him bad news. They may not be able to give him a full accounting of what is happening in Ukraine. And that, I think, tension is going to be exacerbated in the aftermath of this rebellion, which, at least from an outsider's perspective, certainly looked like a test of his power.
What does this mean, if anything, from your sources, to the fighting in Ukraine? It would seem that at first blush, the removal of Wagner from the battlefield is, if nothing else, a reduction in available armed manpower inside the Ukrainian border for Russia.
Yeah, I think that is actually one of the big questions that a lot of folks that I talked to in recent days have mentioned to me. The reality is, as we've heard many stories of Wagner's performance in Bakhmut, and yes, it was a brutal battle with gruesome casualties, rather, because of the sort of human wave attacks that these Wagner forces would participate in. But they did perhaps clinch one of Russia's most substantial victories in their own counteroffensive this winter. And they are hardened, experienced fighters. And taking them off the battlefield could potentially have implications. And so right now, I think what we're watching for is how many Wagner fighters take this so-called deal that is being offered, which they sort of seem to have this option of moving to Belarus with their leader, or perhaps signing up and enlisting with the Russian Ministry of Defense. So will they come to the battlefield? And if so, what will that look like? If Ukraine is on the counteroffensive, sometimes more is more when it comes to defense. But I think one of the questions that a lot of folks I've talked to had is, well, will these fighters be sort of dispersed and placed across the front? And if so, that will certainly mean that they won't necessarily be plotting and planning together, but that may decrease their effectiveness if they have to be absorbed into these other units which have different leadership. And so there is a bit of a push-pull there, I think, that folks are watching for. And maybe a lot of fighters don't end up taking that deal if that's the case, in which case then, yeah, you're losing a potential fighting force that can't easily be reconstituted.
Is Russia rolling up Wagner in the other places in the world where it's active? And has Russia copped to a different relationship with Wagner than it had been willing to publicly admit in the past? Putin, over the years, has always said, oh, well, we don't control these people and we don't pay these people. And then he seemed to, in the days after Rostov and the march on Moscow, sort of done an about-face.
I think that is one of the really big questions that a lot of Wagner watchers have in the aftermath of this rebellion, because Wagner has always ostensibly been sort of a semi-private militia, right? They were doing Russia's business abroad, helping them achieve their geopolitical goals, but with a degree of plausible deniability for Moscow. Our hands are a little bit tied here. This is a private security company. And now, with Wagner kind of gone, I think the question is, well, how much is Russia going to claim ownership of it? And we sort of saw in the aftermath of the rebellion, Sergei Lavrov, who's the Russian foreign minister, make assurances to places where Wagner troops are deployed, saying, oh, no, things won't change, which is sort of a bit like telling on yourself. And so I think the big question now is, how much does Russia sort of take Wagner and its different assets? It has these lucrative contracts. It has these partnerships with states and state clients, but also has a lot of baggage, human rights violations, et cetera. And how much does the Russian government take that under its wing? And if it does that, what does that mean for Wagner's presence? Do countries who employed Wagner say, well, if it's going to be explicitly the Russian government, I don't know if I want to stay on board. And so what is that tension look like, and how does it play out in places like Africa, the Middle East, where we know Wagner has had a really significant presence and still does in many cases?
If you were a reporter watching Eastern Ukraine closely, Prigozhin, for better or worse, was copy. Do you have one fewer window into the battlefield than you had before, even though his information was sometimes dodgy? Was he useful?
I think he was useful to some degree, and it does sort of pain me to say that, but especially in the past month with his videos and dispatches from the battlefield, where he was explicitly calling out these top Russian military officials and saying, we don't have enough ammunition. And I think it was a window into some of the tensions that really are playing out in the Russian military. And of course, we know this, right? Given the high expectations of the Russian military, we've seen them not be able to kind of achieve and really sputter in many ways on the battlefield. And I think the question now that Prigozhin's voice is kind of gone is, how much does his legacy, how much does what he put out into the atmosphere, how much does it influence Russian morale? Russians both fighting, but also Russians at home. Prigozhin became a well-known figure in the process of this. And how much does his, I guess, boldness, how much does it kind of seep into the consciousness of Russians and Russian soldiers as well, who are either fighting this war or who are following this war? But the problem with an authoritarian state like Russia is that ultimately a lot of the decision making comes down to Putin. And so whatever Russians think might not necessarily translate into how Russia conducts itself, either in this war or in terms of geopolitics.
The interesting Hall of Mirrors effect for a reporter is that I'll look at Russian vloggers, of which there are surprisingly many. And one will show you a bunch of people on the streets of a major city in Western Russia, basically saying the things that they hear in official media. And you say, all right, that makes sense. Repeating back to me the problems with Ukraine and how Russia is holding off the entire hostile world to defend itself and so on. Okay, fine. Then you go to another vlogger who basically, in every sentence, contradicts the official narrative about the Russian economy, the state of the Russian economy, the war, shows you surreptitious videos of shopping malls with all the shops closed. And I think, wow, this guy is either very brave, very foolhardy, or this is some kind of setup, and I don't know if I can believe what he's telling me. And so you get this crazy, you feel like you can't believe anything you're seeing from that world, or you just have to see a lot more to crosshatch it all and sort of get a midpoint in that story somewhere. How do you now, after all this time, sort through the kind of tools that we didn't have before? When reporters were covering the Vietnam War and spending a day and a half to get from Washington to Saigon and then sending back film, which had to be developed and edited and then literally physically carried because there was no satellite communication. There was no internet communication. There was no modems and ISDN lines. That world is gone. It's like it never even existed. So now we can see battle in real time. We can see people on the streets of cities on the other side of the globe in real time, but it feels like we can't really believe what anybody's saying in real time.
Which is kind of the remarkable thing about it, right? The more information has not necessarily made us more informed, and that is kind of an interesting wake-up call. And I also think as a reporter, even as I strive to be objective, it is hard to sort of see the events of the past year and a half in Ukraine and also know that the United States government has a stake in the outcome, to not feel sort of, I don't know, sympathetic or sort of understanding of the Ukrainian cause. And so there is sort of a natural inclination when you see either a Ukrainian battlefield success or shuttered stores in Russia to sort of want to believe that, because that feels like the way that we want the narrative to go, or then we want to urge the narrative along. So I think it's also a gut check there to be like, just because this is something you may want to believe doesn't mean it is necessarily the truth of the matter. And I think also vice versa, when we see kind of heinous and gruesome videos, particularly for things like war crimes, there are processes for that, right? There will be prosecutors and investigators to sort through that stuff. And so again, it comes down to time, that in the moment we have to sort of take a pause. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to sort of report on that information and say, like, this is something that we are seeing, but then also caveat with what we don't know and why we're still trying to investigate it and why that investigation could take time and a lot of time. And we may not even know. I mean, that's sort of the thing about news, I think, and you probably know this far better than me. With the distance of time, the things that are happening in the moment always change and shift as we gain more context. And I think just understanding that tension in covering this particular war in Ukraine, but any sort of news right now, is that it is going to look a lot different when we can zoom out and get the full picture.
Jen Kirby covers global stability for Vox, where she's a senior foreign and national security reporter. Please read her there. And Jen Kirby, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much, Ray. It was great to be here.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. Our intern is Adam Ailey. The show was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.